The Finals has some of the cleanest movement available in any modern FPS game. It provides an incredibly fresh and smooth experience with the use of a multitude of different specializations and gadgets, as well as a variety of mechanics and tech. The Finals truly offers an experience like no other, and its movement is at the forefront of it all. In this 3-part miniseries, we will be critically examining 21 of my all-time favorite movement mechanics and abilities. This will not include movement strats, like a lot of other movement videos do. Instead, we will be strictly analyzing raw movement tech. I have chosen to mostly avoid egregious exploits that utilize unintentional aspects of the game's code, but I based this predominantly on the likelihood of Embark removing or fixing the tech in the future, as well as on how long the tech has been in the game thus far, and how game-breaking the tech is. We'll start with the simpler and easier mechanics, and then end with the harder and lesser known ones. I attempted to rank these not only according to difficulty, but also by applicability. There's a high chance that you haven't heard of some of these, so stick around to the end and enjoy learning about some of the hidden movement mechanics of the Finals. Your gameplay will not be the same after this. The dash boost is a movement mechanic that is very common in the Finals. You will likely see contestants utilizing this tech in virtually every map with jump pads and light players. As you likely already know, to pull this off, you need to equip the light archetype with evasive dash. And then, as you approach any jump pad, including ones placed by medium players, you dash into it. The moment you touch the jump pad, your dash's peak speed is locked in, carrying that momentum with you for the entire airborne portion of your trajectory. A fuller technical breakdown of this game's mechanics at play here exists in Part 3 with mechanic number 11. So for now, allow me to provide you with a synopsis. In general, the Finals auto-slows many of the movement mechanics that supply its players with excess amounts of speed, including evasive dash, gateway, zipline, charge and slam, anti-gravity cube, sliding, and even bunny hopping. This is done for balancing purposes. However, there are cases where this rule does not apply. Jump pads are one such example. Jump pads of any kind do not perform an automatic speed check to limit your momentum. Instead, they preserve your current velocity and apply it directly to the launch, regardless of your current speed. This means that, by dashing directly before hitting the jump pad, you are able to preserve your dash speed until you interact with another component of the map. This preservation can also be magnified with low gravity. This exception in automatic speed reduction is consistent with any movement mechanic applied alongside jump pad. Even more basic movement boost sources, like sliding, allow you to be carried further, faster, by executing it directly before interacting with the jump pad. There's even been some interesting sister sub-tech being developed in relation to dash boost. Glitchy Unknown has discovered that when using Gravity Vortex right next to a gateway, with the opposing portal being located right next to a jump pad, and then triggering the vortex and holding the interact button to enter the gateway, you will be thrown into the jump pad at similar speeds to the dash boost, effectively allowing all classes access to that mobility capacity. So, with this system in mind, it is almost always worth reserving a dash if you're heading towards a jump pad as a light. It allows for incredible cross-map traversal, and it is one of the fastest forms of transportation in the finals, with next to no skills required. Goo Shear Boosting, sometimes simply called Goo Tech, is a basic movement tech popularized by YouTuber Truce. Known for his specialty in movement mechanics, Truce has optimized this tech far beyond anyone else in the game, at least publicly. To pull off this technique, you must stand on a breakable object in the game, toss goo just to the right of the object, and then move slightly to the left. If done correctly, the goo will break the object you are standing on, at which point you will be sent flying in the direction the goo wall was generated. It is much easier to attempt on the right side of you rather than the left, because goo is held in the player's right hand. This used to be easier a couple seasons ago, but modern changes to the way goo works has made this tech much harder to pull off optimally. Regardless, the capability still seems to exist. It is merely much harder to execute. Realistically though, this movement mechanic is on its way out unless something changes. Goo Pop Jump, confusingly also referred to as Goo Tech, is another simple movement mechanic in the finals. This one involves using the goo gun. By shooting a goo kernel on the ground and then attaching another one onto the first with it also touching the ground, you are then able to break the first kernel, which causes the second one to jut up into the air, popping the player up with it. This tech used to be extremely effective, generating 2 to 3 story height on good attempts. However, in the current season, it appears as though changes implemented to Goo in the past have limited the scope of this tech significantly. Now it appears as though we are capped at around 1 story. This does not mean that this movement mechanic is useless though. You see, if this Goo tech is performed during low gravity, the height is roughly quintupled, yielding even stronger results than pre-nerf Goo Pop Jumps. In this case, the user is able to generate significant thrust upwards. This tech is all of a sudden surprisingly effective now. And, especially in comparison to other vertical focused mobility techs, this one is one of the cheapest. Up until Lucid and I attempted this in low gravity, I was ready to omit this tech from this miniseries entirely. It appeared to be pretty much useless 99% of the time, especially considering the fact that if one already had a goo gun, which is required to perform this tech, then they could just use one extra goo kernel to get to their desired location. However, after seeing just how impressive it is under the low gravity event, I would actually suggest that you practice this one a little bit so that you are ready to pull this one out during low gravity. If I ever happen to have this loadout in a game with low gravity, I would honestly be searching for opportunities to utilize this. The attached Proxy launch is a very under-the-radar movement tech that you probably don't know about. It is possible with both Guardian Turret and APS Turret, as well as Lockbolt. The reason why one of these three objects are required is because they are the only deployables that can attach to carryables. By attaching it onto a canister, climbing up onto the turret or the Lockbolt anchor, and shooting the canister below, it sends the gadget, and subsequently you, high into the air. This works with a variety of different canisters, including glitch, oil, and powder barrels. By standing on top of a turret or Lockbolt, you are also able to avoid taking any damage from the explosion of the orange barrels, as the gadget absorbs all of the blast. It is also worth mentioning here that some types of barrels, like oil barrels, require 2 shots to explode instead of 1. Another component to keep in mind here is the fact that Lockbolt, when unable to locate a player or object to connect to, will disappear in around a second. However, the object remains in the world for its usual duration. It just becomes invisible. This means that, even if you waited until after the Lockbolt anchor disappears, you might still be able to perform this tech. This mechanic is actually very simple to set up and easy to pull off, assuming one of the aforementioned canisters is readily available. If one is, then this can be very reasonably pulled off mid-match. The height generated here is also unprecedented. This attached Proxy launch now grants access to nearly every vertically demanding and advantageous point in the game. Despite the cost of a gadget or specialization, the payoff of this mechanic can be substantial. This is another movement tech that I would recommend you try out for yourself. Barrel riding, affectionately referred to as rocket riding, cites the ability for players' momentum to be influenced by arena carryables. Nearly 100% of the time, we are referring to explosive canisters, formerly known as propane gas tanks, colloquially called red barrels. The reason why we specify the red barrels is because these canisters fly differently than all of the other ones in the game, being automatically propelled forward as opposed to flying in an arch like any other arena carryable. The self-propulsion is important because it means that these canisters fly at a constant velocity and direction, which lends itself to influencing players' momentum in a much more consistent and replicable manner. Most of the time, player momentum being changed as a result of a thrown barrel is accidental, as it is exceedingly rare and difficult to throw the barrel at such a perfect trajectory. In order to successfully propel a player forward, the canister must come into contact with the player in such a way as to be treated as a floor, at which point the player's momentum is pseudo-locked to it, not dissimilar to how moving platforms influence the player's movement. Okay, why am I lagging? However, there is a second way to initiate barrel riding: standing on top of the barrel before it is set off. If the player aligns himself on top of the canister properly and then shoots the canister, it will carry the player with it until the player inevitably slips off. But at this point, the contestant is already well on their way in whichever direction they oriented the canister originally. This can also be executed vertically, providing players with significant thrust upwards, especially when coupled with a well-timed jump. It is worth specifying here that where you shoot the canister matters. If you shoot the main body of the red barrel, it will fly for around a second before erratically spinning, ending in a quick explosion. This is the only way to trigger vertical barrel riding without a partner. But if you are able to shoot the tip of the red barrel, then it will fly much more consistently and will not explode until it comes into contact with another object. In most scenarios, shooting the tip of the canister is the better option, as it allows for much more distance to be covered with better accuracy. I must admit that I was rather skeptical of the viability of this tech when I first added this one to the list. However, after experimenting with it for half an hour or so, I was very pleasantly surprised at just how effective this one was. The sheer distance that can be covered, especially with proper balancing and an extra boost by falling in front of the canister, is significantly more than I anticipated. I would go as far as to say that if I wasn't confined to melee weapons in this game, I would be using this movement mechanic regularly in matches. It is extremely satisfying, and it also is incredibly helpful. I highly recommend you try this one out. Hello! The Tripad Slam Boost, or what I like to call a ground pound, is, for all intents and purposes, the precursor to the Tripad Lunge Boost, explored in Part 1. Slam Boost is a movement tech that has actually existed for a while, despite its elusivity. The ground pound is an abuse of the triangle bounce pads that exist in certain maps of the finals, which include Seoul, Kyoto, Skyway Stadium, and Fortune Stadium. Let's get technical for a second. The triangle bounce pads are different from regular jump pads because they send players on a fixed, hard-coded initial trajectory, rather than simply allotting players vertical velocity while allowing for the retention of manual lateral mobility. For triangle bounce pads, once the player is sent on their way from the initial launch, the player regains control of their contestant. However, adjusting one's trajectory is relatively limited in this case, as one's motion vector has already been automatically adjusted to transport the player in a particular direction at a specific speed and height. This essentially means that, regardless of the direction or speed or angle at which you hit the triangle bounce pad, you will always be initially launched along the same exit path. The Tripad Slam Boost is significant because it was the only tech that could override and modify this hard-coded trajectory of triangle bounce pads. That was until a couple weeks ago with the discovery of Tripad Lunge Boosting. See mechanic number 6 in Part 1 for more details. Despite this, the Tripad Slam Boost is much easier to pull off consistently than the new Lunge Boost. The Tripad Slam Boost is only possible with the heavy archetype equipped with Charge and Slam. By triggering the slam part of the Charge and Slam carefully on the edge of the triangle bounce pad, you are able to gain an immense excess in speed and direction. Fundamentally, your exit motion vector is scaled up, or amplified. This amplification is directly correlated to the bounce pad's initial intended trajectory. If the triangle bounce pad intends to send you slowly in a more horizontal direction, then the ground pound trajectory will send you a bit faster and further forward. If the triangle bounce pad intends to send you flying high into the air, then your ground pound trajectory will send you significantly higher. This Tripad Slam Boost requires precision to be executed successfully. Too far away and you will miss the bounce pad entirely. Too close and you will bounce on the bounce pad normally. You need to perfectly hit the triangle bounce pad in a way that your slam makes contact with the ground so that it actually executes. But it also needs to make contact with the bounce pad to trigger the exit motion vector. By making contact with both of these surfaces at the same time, the game mistakenly sends you on your exit trajectory with the excess force from your Charge and Slam. This is easiest to perform, in my opinion, if you aim for the corners of the triangle bounce pad. This movement tech is extremely useful and can get you to places you normally cannot access quickly, or at all, in normal circumstances. It can be used offensively by gaining ground to catch up to people or cut players off. But it can also be used defensively by gaining distance, allowing you to quickly get away with no easy way to follow. So if you are a player who mains Charge and Slam, then this might be a non-optional mechanic to start utilizing. Zipline Teleportation is one of the most outrageous movement techs in the finals history, and it is predicated on a largely unknown and rarely documented anomaly in the game. As such, Zipline Teleportation is not completely understood from a computer science standpoint. Nevertheless, allow me to share my theory. When ziplines work normally, the game treats them like a traversal state machine. You attach, the system sets up a start endpoint and target endpoint, and then it advances your position along the cable over many frames until you reach the target endpoint. Zipline Teleportation is a rare edge case that occurs when the player receives two attached to zipline requests in the same frame, usually caused by a player spamming the attach button. Importantly, this only works if you are attempting to attach to the zipline from the back. I know this may come as a surprise to many of you, but ziplines do actually have a front side and a back side. This can be more easily seen with manually placed ziplines, but the same logic also applies to already existing ziplines. Attempting the same inputs as described above at the front endpoint instead of the back one does not trigger the teleportative behavior, strongly suggesting that the zipline's back attachment node initializes traversal differently than the front one, which wouldn't be too terribly uncommon in a system like this. This fundamentally means that this movement tech only works back to front, and not vice versa. It is worth briefly noting here that the direction you travel on the zipline is determined by your momentum direction at the moment you attach, not by where you're standing relative to the endpoints. In other words, the zipline determines which way is forward for you based upon your velocity vector. The core trigger for zipline teleportation is duplicate input processing. You are tricking the game into processing a second attach request before the first attach has finished settling the zipline state. Upon the first attach request, the zipline initialization system begins its setup. Direction selection, target endpoint selection, constraint creation, progress initiation. If a second attach press lands within the same frame, the second call can observe a half-attached or invalid attached state. Some fields are set, like target end, while others are not, like fully initialized constraints or stable progress. Many traversal systems include a safety rule for exactly this kind of inconsistent state. Its purpose is to prevent the player from being left in a broken state and to force a stable outcome. In this case, for ziplines, the safest stable outcomes are the endpoints, so the second attach could end up requesting the system to reconcile immediately to the target end rather than continuing a normal per-frame ride. Visualized on the screen is pseudocode I wrote to help you digest it all. The key is to realize that the teleportation is not some inexplicable bug in the code. It is a built-in failsafe that the developers hoped would never need to be called. To put it simply, by calling for a second attach before the first attach initialization is complete, the second attach reads the player's zipline data and observes invalid, but really just incomplete, data. Upon seeing this, the emergency exit system is triggered in order to prioritize stability over correctness. This emergency exit system then snaps you to a known good anchor point rather than leaving you in a half-resolved situation and risking you being stuck in a mid-transition state. However, there is still more to this story. We've been throwing the word teleport around here a lot, but that technically isn't correct. If this were a true teleport, the player would always appear cleanly at the endpoint. As it turns out though, this isn't always the case. As you can observe here, if something obstructs the zipline's path, you get dropped off partway, next to the obstruction. This is normal zipline behavior, and this implies that this skip is implemented more like a single huge movement attempt along the cable with collision checks. The system attempts to advance you toward the target endpoint in one update. However, if the sweep collision check detects something, then it stops at that hit point and detaches you. Nonetheless, not all zipline traversal inhibitors get triggered during this emergency exit process. Normally, if the player were to hit a jump pad while riding a zipline, for example, the player would be ejected by the jump pad and automatically detached from the zipline. However, in the case of zipline teleportation, the jump pad has no effect. The emergency exit system likely has its one hard-coded check for collision, and it is the only type of check that is made throughout one's teleport to the end. But in normal circumstances, the zipline would be making multiple checks of varying types. It is highly probable that objects like walls and doors and goo fall into one category, collision objects, while items like jump pad, gravity vortex, and manual player dismounting fall into another, trigger objects. Put in simpler terms, zipline teleportation checks only for collision objects along its path. But under normal circumstances, riding a zipline makes checks for both collision objects and trigger objects. All of this to say, zipline teleportation is easier to pull off than you might think. It just requires a lot of very tight spamming at the back end of the zipline. Most of the time, it probably isn't worth attempting in-game. However, if you are trying to flee while being actively chased, or you are down to the final few seconds with no time to spare, then zipline teleportation might just be your last hope. As stated in part 1, before we conclude each of these videos, I would like to share one bonus tech related to movement that is too subtle and specific for its own segment. In this video, we will be looking at the heavy crawl. There are several components of the game that are reserved for the light and medium classes. One such example is crawl vents. Or is it? Well, as it turns out, this actually might not be true. You see, heavy players are actually capable of fitting into small spaces like this. The problem is that they cannot get initially low enough to enter them. If they are somehow able to get their hitbox that low, however, then they are able to move around like normal. So, a question is raised. How can we get a heavy's hitbox lower? One solution is the Goo gun. Conveniently a specialization for the heavy archetype, the Goo gun can create a ceiling that gradually lowers itself, effectively pushing a heavy's hitbox lower over time. However, as you can probably guess, it is very inconvenient, and it is actually somewhat difficult to perfectly position your goo in a way that yields effective results. Enter Season 7, with the introduction of the healing emitter. Another item specifically for the heavy class, the healing emitter has the ability to be placed along any floor or wall. So, if you crouch right next to a crawl vent and then place the healing emitter directly above you, the ball actually pushes you downward, allowing you to fit inside the vent. Once through, you can even pick Chuck back up and continue on your way. This is possible with any carryable object affected by gravity, including arena props and canisters. Larger ones, like the orange barrels, tend to work best here. This can actually be rather convenient if you do not have a destructive item in your kit, like the sledgehammer, KS-23, RPG, C4, or Charge and Slam, or if any of those said destructive items are currently on cooldown. It is simple, relatively easy to pull off, and costs next to nothing. As a sledge main, I do not personally utilize this movement ability. However, it certainly would not surprise me if it ended up being useful for you. This concludes part 2 of this mini-series covering movement in the finals. Every mechanic being shown here will be covered in one of the 3 videos in this series, so stay ready.